Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we're closing out Volume 2 of Sense and Sensibility with chapters 28 to 36, in which we discover the truth about Willoughby. We see Colonel Brandon open up to Eleanor in what is a serious contender for best scene of the entire book. And then we have to put up with a lot of boring, pompous men. Only two, I suppose, but God, it feels like more than that. We're going to begin with chapter 28. First of all, a quick acknowledgement that the beginning tonight was a little scattered. We're just taking a little friction coming into the live stream tonight, not least of all because the update did not post to Patreon this afternoon, the announcement post. So I apologize if you guys are finding this a little late. My chat right now seems to be empty. No, I have a couple people here. That's good. I'm glad something somewhere is working despite my best efforts to confound the internet. So, into chapter 28, in which Eleanor and Marianne are attending a party thrown by Lady Middleton, only to bump into Willoughby, who is super chill about the whole thing. And if we are beginning tonight with what feels like an abrupt transition into actual, plot, that's because we definitely are. I mentioned last week that the pace of Sense and Sensibility is not quite the machined precise thing that it will be in Austen's later novels. It still feels a little compromised, and as I was saying last week, because of what I now take to be, because of the reading that we discussed last time, the actual underlying epistolary nature of this novel as it was first conceived, and the carefully orchestrated timeline thereof, I can understand why these events aren't quite aligning. We're going to have a lot of action in the first half of this week's reading, and then not much is going to happen through the rest of Volume 2. We're going to be able to dispense with those chapters pretty swiftly, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to get some really top-flight stuff, some Austen at her absolute best, and that begins right here, right now, with the reintroduction of Willoughby. At last, he turned round again and regarded them both. She started up, and pronouncing his name in a tone of affection, held out her hand to him. He approached, and addressing himself rather to Eleanor than Marianne, as if wishing to avoid her eye, and determined not to observe her attitude, inquired in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood, and asked how long they had been in town. Eleanor was robbed of all presence of mind by such an address, and was unable to say a word. But the feelings of her sister were instantly expressed. Her face was crimsoned over, and she exclaimed in a voice of the greatest emotion, "Good God, Willoughby, what is the meaning of this? Have you not received my letters? Will you not shake hands with me?" He could not then avoid it, but her touch seemed painful to him, and he held her hand only for a moment. During all this time, he was evidently struggling for composure. Eleanor watched his countenance and saw its expression becoming more tranquil. After a moment's pause, he spoke with calmness. "I did myself the honour of calling in Berkeley Street last Tuesday, and very much regretted that I was not fortunate enough to find yourselves and Mrs. Jennings at home. My card was not lost, I hope." There's so much here that's just fantastic. All of Marianne's immediacy. We're reminded, of course, of the passage in the previous reading about Marianne's inability to express anything that is not completely authentic, so she relies upon her sister to lie for her during moments of social friction, of social tension, and we see that absolutely here. Eleanor kind of being thrust once more into the breach, though the narrative voice carefully notes that Eleanor is just as shocked by Willoughby's behavior as her sister is. Eleanor was robbed of all presence of mind by such an address. And we can understand by now, I think, how spectacular that rudeness has to be in order to shake Eleanor out of her composure. She who remains so composed so often. I want to note here, too, about the handshake. We were talking last week about various levels of intimacy by the standards of the Regency period, and how it is not at all inappropriate for a young man and a young woman who are unmarried to spend time privately, the one with the other, because there's really no suspicion of an inclination toward impropriety. But there are things which are still relatively scandalous, and absolutely sending letters, as I mentioned last week, is one of them, but also the shaking of hands between a man and a woman is an incredibly intimate gesture. This is why Willoughby here is so reluctant, because this is a public gesture of affection, of intimacy. This is an act which may, under other circumstances, and if seen by the wrong person, condemn him just as surely as the letter that Colonel Brandon witnessed between Marianne and Willoughby condemned him under those circumstances. So Marianne is understandably stricken by this coldness, this rudeness, as Elizabeth calls out in the chant here, leaving her hanging. Rude, completely rude, right? This Willoughby not proving himself to be to be particularly deft at this part of the arrangement, right? It is noted, I guess, let's frame this out just a little bit, because this is going to be completely crucial as we move forward through the rest of our reading. In order to understand exactly what is happening here, we have to understand that Willoughby has walked a very fine line, because for all that it's okay for men and women to spend time together, for all that it's okay for men and women to converse without there being any hint of scandal in the air, as we see again and again with Eleanor and Colonel Brandon, for example, right? It is comedic to us. It is satirical that her brother John Dashwood believes that there is a romantic interest in Colonel Brandon for Eleanor just because they are spending time together. He is revealed to be ignorant because he assumes that there is this romantic friction between the two of them. I've used the word friction 3 times already in tonight's podcast, and it's barely 5 minutes in, so I'm going to try not to use that one anymore. And by, of course, drawing attention to it, now I've only made it all the more likely that I will fall back on that word again. So there's no hint of impropriety that you are spending time with someone else, but there is a kind of social taboo against flirtation. It is absolutely appropriate for a man to be complimentary, right? We see that kind of here from Willoughby. We will see that in great degree in Willoughby's letter to Marianne, his ultimately very dismissive, dear John kind of letter. But he even then is walking this fine line of appropriate social engagement. He is not behaving scandalously. Had he encouraged Marianne, had he said, I love you, for example, that is almost as binding, if expressed in exactly those words, as an offer of marriage. So the rake, the flirt, the cad, the gadfly, these men have to be extremely careful in how they conduct themselves. And this is one of those moments where Willoughby, well, if he doesn't completely cross the line, he is at least standing on the line, looking over the precipice into what lays beyond, the frontier of social ruin for him here when he takes Marianne's hand, and even having her call out to him, good God, Willoughby, right? We mentioned this before, not Mr. Willoughby. Now she is using his name, not his first name, but his used name, as it were, right? So she's already breaking kind of the social pact here. She's already exceeding what is expected of her as a well-born and well-raised young woman, though of course she is caught up in this moment of romance and passion and urgency and the belief that in fact their relationship is more significant than it turns out to be. It's a really compelling kind of reintroduction of Willoughby, and what's brilliant is that we're going to end next week's reading on the other great reintroduction of Willoughby. We'll talk about that when we get to it. So this introduces all of this this complexity, right? We're dealing again with Marianne's romantic inclination, capital R, romantic inclination. She is feeling her feelings, and as we discussed in last week's reading, this is not a pose or a posture as much as it is a commitment to what she perceives to be the kind of the Aristotelian virtue ethics of her community, right? Like she is embodying that which she holds to be most virtuous and valid under these circumstances. So she's doing her thing as Eleanor is doing her thing, kind of fending off these social inquiries, fending off the intrusions, fending off the gossip as much as she possibly can. Mrs. Jennings, of course, being the chief culprit. Let's skip ahead because there's little enough past Marianne's misery, which is, of course, pronounced through this part of the book. Nothing really hits us until we get to Willoughby's letter. Let's skip ahead here. Bond Street, January. My dear madam, I have just had the honour of receiving your letter, for which I beg to return my sincere acknowledgements. I am much concerned to find there was anything in my behaviour last night that did not meet your approbation, and though I am quite at a loss to discover in what point I could be so unfortunate as to offend you, I entreat your forgiveness of what I can assure you to have been perfectly unintentional. I shall never reflect on my former acquaintance with your family in Devonshire without the most grateful pleasure, and flatter myself that it not be broken by any mistake or misapprehension of my actions. My esteem for your whole family is very sincere. But if I have been so unfortunate as to give rise to a belief of more than I felt or meant to express, I shall reproach myself for not having been more guarded in my professions of that esteem. That I should ever have meant more, you will allow me to be impossible, when you understand that my affections have been long engaged elsewhere, and it will not be many weeks, I believe, before this engagement is fulfilled. It is with great regret that I obey your commands of returning the letters which I have been, the letters with which I have been honoured from you, and the lock of hair which you so obligingly bestowed on me. I am, dear madam, your most obedient, humble servant, John Willoughby. And on the one hand, a superficial reading here, kind of gets us to the point. It kind of gets us where we need to go in terms of what Willoughby is doing, what Willoughby is expressing here, which is yeah, there was never anything there. Crazy that you thought there was anything there just because 2 weeks after meeting you, I took you on a tour of the house that I hope one day to inherit. And we were basically, decorating like it was an HGTV show. We were kind of taking in the place and considering exactly where we would put our brood of children in Allenham House. But there's something even worse happening here right under the surface. There's something even more insidious here, which is not just the this is not an apology. This is an apology if your feelings were hurt, right? I'm sorry that you feel that way kind of apology at best. But more than that, it is a repositioning of the blame for this act onto Marianne. He's looking at her inference into his actions and words more than he is looking at his own actions, right? I shall never reflect on my former acquaintance with your family in Devonshire without the most grateful pleasure, and flatter myself it will not be broken by any mistake or misapprehension of my actions. If my relationship with your family is broken now, that is the product of a mistake or misapprehension of my actions. Not my mistake, you understand? Your mistake, Marianne, for thinking that there was more here than there was. It's kind of brilliant. And the transition here, too, we should note exactly where we are in terms of the evolution of the novel, because one of the primary kind of virtues of the early epistolary novel to readers is that, as we said last week, it was not completely appropriate Regency conduct between two unmarried people to send correspondence directly. So part of the appeal of the epistolary novel and part of the appeal of these letters as they are represented here in the text of this book is it's titillating, right? This is a window into exactly the kind of prurient and intimate and sexually and romantically charged intimacies that readers of this era wanted in their fictional characters. But rather than holding the reader at a distance, rather than recounting the events of the story to the reader, here we're getting the actual document, right? That is the great power of the epistolary novel, the great power of kind of repositioning narrative within diegetic documentation is that it feels intimate. It feels powerful. I am particularly, as I've said in 100 podcasts before, particularly susceptible to this. This is a narrative and dramatic form that basically always works on me. I don't think there's a found footage movie out there, that doesn't work on me. I don't think there's such a thing. I love epistolary novels. I love this idea that the thing that you are holding is a product of the world of the story itself. Obviously, that's a big part of my well-attested and well-documented love of Professor Tolkien's work, too. As Skipa says here in the chat, you misunderstood. I did nothing wrong. So infuriating. Absolutely infuriating, right? And really, I think, well, it's still not resolved. We still don't actually know what is going on with Willoughby, right? Because of this positioning of himself as a complete innocent, right? A babe in the woods. Here I am, really liking your family, really liking your adorable little cottage, which I praised extensively. I have been nothing but courteous. And this whole time I've been engaged, by the way, which I never mentioned at any point and which is not common knowledge. That has not been in any way dispersed into society, the news of that engagement. But as we see here, it will not be many weeks, I believe, before this engagement is fulfilled. We're going to pick up on exactly what that means in the pages to come. Before we get to that, we're going to be taking a quick look at Marianne's response, of course, and this continues through several pages. We get a long conversation here between Eleanor and Marianne where we are really exploring this idea of what Marianne holds to be important and similarly, right, what Eleanor holds to be important. These are ideological conversations. This is a clash of ideology, at least as much as it is, you know, a drawing room depiction of two sisters, one of whom is grieving and the other who is trying to reach her sister with empathy and with care and with provision. Let's take a look at, for me, the real high point here. Oh, Skipa's asking here before we get to this, under what circumstances is it just something casual to take a lock of someone's hair? I'm from a religion where things like that are used in rituals. You don't just give them away lightly, right? I mean, it is one of those things which, you're right, Skiba, has been loaded with significance and import in religious exercises and spiritual exercises through the ages. Hair certainly, even names, right? We recognize hair as being a curiously intimate thing, and it was absolutely in the Georgian period, certainly, right? But by the time we get to the Regency, it is fashionable. It is a thing. It is a token that can be bestowed, right? We haven't quite arrived at having your booze picture on the lock screen of your cell phone. But, that's an extension of the same thing too. If we had easy image replication in the Georgian period, we probably wouldn't have been relying on locks of hair. But there is, I think you're absolutely right, something literally totemic, right? There was something literally symbolic of the taking of the lock of hair and the enclosing of the lock of hair in a locket or in a ring sometimes. There were even these gross and garish, to my eye at least, these giant signet rings that could open and in which would be contained a little lock of hair. As Elizabeth says, even before we knew about DNA, right? Fascinating, which is, I think, completely true, but also, yeah, you're right, so symbolically powerful. You are taking something that we now know, from modern science, we now know kind of does carry the identity of the individual within it. But even at the time, it was recognized to be very intimate, very, very, very special. Let's get into this reading here, which begins with the fantastic sentence, "Eleanor could no longer witness the torrent of unresisted grief in silence." "Exert yourself, dear Marianne," she cried. "If you will not kill yourself and all who love you, think of your mother. Think of her misery while you suffer. For her sake, you must exert yourself." I cannot, cried Marianne. Leave me if I distress you. Leave me, hate me, forget me, but do not torture me so. Oh, how easy for those who have no sorrow of their own to talk of exertion. Happy, happy Eleanor. You cannot have an idea of what I suffer." "Do you call me happy, Marianne? Oh, if you knew. And can you believe me to be so while I see you so wretched? Forgive me, throwing her arms around her sister's neck. "I know you feel for me. I know what a heart you have. But yet you must be happy. Edward loves you. What can do away such happiness as that?" "Many, many circumstances," said Eleanor solemnly. And this is it, right? This is really the focal point. This is the crux of their clash of ideology, which is that Marianne believes in part, right, and to take nothing away from the authenticity of her emotion in this moment, but she believes in part that virtue can be found in the full measure of that emotion, the expressing of the fullest measure of that emotion, while Eleanor does believe that it is in the exertion, right? When she's saying exert yourself, she's saying pull yourself together. She's saying, come on, get a grip here. There is rationality to fall back on. There is the intellect to fall back on. There is sense to fall back on against this tide of sensibility. You need to pull yourself together and think of how it is affecting you. Think about the deleterious effect on your body. Let's asterisk that, because there is apparently a pronounced deleterious effect on Marianne's body because of this event, right? Because of these series of events, I suppose. But also think about the consequence of this emotional outpouring on the people around you, on the people who love you. And again, we're kind of this has been the ongoing kind of Willoughby story for Marianne for last week's reading and this week's reading, but this absolutely echoes back to the death of their father, Henry Dashwood, right at the beginning of the novel. You remember where Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood are kind of in this high order kind of operatic mode of self-expression, and Eleanor is not. This tension here is so often misunderstood, like flatly misunderstood by casual readers and casual critics. I'm going to go back to one of my favorite kind of talking points when it comes to classic literature here, which is that most books ought not to be taught in high school, right? Most books are not intended for a juvenile audience. And when you try to connect a juvenile audience to an adult book, and that juvenile audience does not have the full spectrum of emotion, they do not have the grit within them, they have not yet formed the pearls of wisdom from the sand of grief and of heartache and of suffering and of empathy and compassion and love and experience, right? You try to communicate great works of classic literature to a juvenile audience at your peril, because 9 times out of 10, you're going to turn that audience all the way off. 9 times out of 10, you are going to present them with something that they do not have the emotional vocabulary to handle, to meaningfully engage with. And in fairness, right, Austen is not taught a lot in high schools anymore for all the wrong reasons. But there are good reasons why Austen ought not to be taught in high schools, because if you read Sense and Sensibility and you present it as, well, one of these girls just has big feelings and one of these girls is a bit of a cold fish, can you tell who's better off? That is not what the book is doing. That is a dreadful, facile, superficial misreading of the book. So I always want to kind of reclaim these books that so many people have fallen out with, right? You know, Gatsby is a big victim of this, Steinbeck across the board, Salinger across the board. I think there are so many books, particularly like books of the modern American canon, right? I've been thinking a lot about how books are presented in middle school and in high school here in the US for the last, 15 years. But even, classics of the entire Anglophonic canon, I suppose, which are those classics about which I am equipped to discuss. So many of them have suffered so many of them have been hollowed out and made simple and straightforward and palatable for a juvenile audience that was never supposed to get them in the first place. And that's just sad, right? Even if those discussions could be presented as, hey, here's a perspective on Gatsby. Here's a perspective on Of Mice and Men. This isn't all that the book is about, but this is a way of looking at the book, and we can, talk about the other ways of looking at the book when you guys are in college, or when you're 35, or when you're, divorced. We can take a look at what these things really mean, or other meanings that these books contain. But of course, so much of English lit pedagogy over the last 50 years has been oriented around this idea, which Professor Tolkien would loathe, of course, that texts are there to be solved. A story, a book, is a nut to crack. And when you have cracked it, you can kind of put it on the shelf, not as a beloved friend or a encapsulation of real wisdom, of real learning, of real life, of real insight, but rather as a trophy of something that you have conquered. And that's just kind of one of the ways in which our education system right now, vis-a-vis books and the humanities, is really shot, is just kind of not in a great place. So anyway, all of that is to say that this pretty complicated book. Let's keep moving on here. Oh, the other thing that I really wanted to call out before we move on from this, because it's very important, in part because of the way that it allows us to understand what Marianne is doing, what she's experiencing, yes, but also the action that she is taking here, because in this way too, she is exactly like her mother. She is extending this hopeful branch of explanation to Willoughby. She wants there to be a narrative that can account for all of his many actions, right? We saw this when Willoughby first disappeared from Devonshire, and Mrs. Dashwood spends a full half hour trying to solve this intractable problem, trying to cut through this Gordian knot and come up with an explanation. And she does come up with an explanation that is satisfactory to her and bears no relation to the actual truth of the matter. And here Marianne is not engaging in the same kind of active narrativization that we saw from Mrs. Dashwood in last week's reading, but the same kind of motivation underlies her actions. She still wants there to be an explanation. She still wants to be able to say, this thing that you have done seems awful. Help me to build a story so that I can excuse it, because a priori I want to excuse it. I'm coming in with the desire, the selfish emotional desire to not change my opinion of you. I want you to be the person that I believed you to be, even when I was wrong. So please give me this explanation. And that, of course, comes up here as we move into this slide. As Eleanor accuses Willoughby of not feeling the same in return, Marianne replies, "He did feel the same, Eleanor. For weeks and weeks he felt it. I know he did. Whatever may have changed him now, and nothing but the blackest art employed against me can have done it. I was once as dear to him as my own soul could wish. This lock of hair, which now he can so readily give up, was begged of me with the most earnest supplication. Have you seen his look, his manner? Had you heard his voice at that moment? Have you forgot the last evening of our being together at Barton? The morning that we parted, too, when he told me that it might be many weeks before we met again. His distress. Can I ever forget his distress?" For a moment or two she could say no more, but when this emotion had passed away, she added in a firmer tone, "Eleanor, I have been cruelly used, but not by Willoughby." And she goes on, of course. Eleanor asks her, by whom has she then been cruelly used? And Marianne, bereft of this explanation, answers, gestures at everything, right? In that moment. Everyone and everything, the world, which again, I kind of touched on this last week, but I really wanted to circle back to it right now, because this is also the modern world. This is also the world in which we live. The world is not lying in accord with the narrative as I understand it. I cannot imagine that Willoughby was being deceitful through our long relationship. Therefore, something must have changed him, and nothing but the blackest art employed against me could have done it, she says, right? And even there, she's kind of acknowledging that she's not fully engaging with circumstances as they are. This lock of hair, which now he can so readily give up, was begged of me with the most earnest supplication. Okay, not to take anything, in Willoughby's credit here, but she did ask for it back, and he returned it. Right? This is not proof of the great emotional conspiracy against Marianne Dashwood at this point, I think. But nonetheless, she is pushed here beyond the bound of understanding. She cannot, from her worldview, understand exactly what has happened here. And so seeks an explanation that kind of defies rationality and encompasses everyone and everything, encompasses the great shadowy world beyond her own experience. Someone out there is engaged in the blackest art, and it's focused in on me, because that is easier for me to believe in this moment than to believe I was wrong, or than to process with an honest kind of clarity the broken heart that she's now feeling. And to kind of lay this out very clearly with red thread on a cork board, that is what gets us to modern conspiracy culture, right? I said last time that this desire to narrativize until you find something that fits your predetermined view of the world, well, when the evidence, when the facts, when real life doesn't fit your view of the world, it is because of enemy action. It is because there is a conspiracy out there. It is because someone somewhere is lying, someone is being deceitful, and they are probably focused directly and specifically on you. Skipa says in the chat here, high school English lit like to introduce books with teens but didn't bother putting their lives in context. Sure, I like stories about teens, but what do I know about teens in 1790 or 1955? Teachers didn't try to connect those stories to my life. Of course, I went to Catholic school, so I should be grateful we even had desks. Yeah, I mean, it is, on the one hand, right, having just been very condemnatory of our pedagogical approach to teaching English lit in high school classrooms in particular over the last 50 years, the culture that kind of underpins that, it is a hard thing to do. It's an extremely difficult thing to do. But of course, like all very difficult things, that's what makes it valuable. Elizabeth saying here too, such a different pain for Eleanor, not to doubt the love, but to know her hope is lost because Edward is honorable. Isn't it fascinating? I do agree with that, Elizabeth. I think that's a great insight. But isn't it fascinating how much that story just disappears now? There's no air in the room for it anymore. And Eleanor is not the sort to intrude upon the narrative voice. She's not taking over the story and saying, we don't get a chapter that is the next morning I left Marianne at home and went out to walk the streets because I was just feeling so sad about Edward and everything that had happened. And I really wanted to avoid Lucy Steele once more. We don't do that. We don't get that kind of interiority. There's this almost serialized approach to the text. These things don't become urgent until they are urgent, and then they remain urgent for as long as they are the focus of the story, and then we kind of not exactly move past them, but we don't divide our focus. It's a very kind of unitary text in that sense. We are doing one thing at a time, which I think is one of the things that makes the kind of irregular pace and irregular structure of the novel as challenging as it is, because when we're doing something really great, we are consumed by it. It is everything that the book is doing. And then when we're doing something that is a little satirical skit, or we're spending time kind of prefacing what comes next, or we're introducing, a new character that we're really not going to like, which we're going to do at the end of this week's reading, then that's all that there is in the text. It's hard, therefore, to pull out these different strands as fully as a modern writer would, I'm sure. Elizabeth saying, do you think the book would be stronger if we were a little closer to Eleanor? It does feel very far removed. I think that's such an interesting question. I'm kind of pulling on my camera here, so I'm going to try and reset that just a little bit, and it's not going to work, and now we're just distracted for the whole rest of the show. The perils of live broadcasting, you guys, is that I have a short cable connecting that camera to my computer, and if I move my computer, as I sometimes have to, it definitely moves the camera too. Patreon.com/nextword for, longer cables. Your money can help save me this heartache. Yes, I mean, as I've said before, right, I genuinely think that one of the great virtues of Sense and Sensibility is this split protagonism. I really do think that it is to the book's enormous credit. It is part of the book's enormous power that we are able to hold in suspension Marianne and Eleanor's points of view as much as we are ever like profoundly and deeply in their points of view. Would it be... It's difficult, right? Because would the Marianne book be better if it was all about Marianne? Yes, it would. We would have more access to her interiority. We would be able to track her emotional arcs better. We see in later books that Austen can do that brilliantly, right? The Marianne book would be better if we were in Marianne's POV, and the Eleanor book would be better if we were in Eleanor's POV. But the Eleanor book is a worse Marianne book, because there's no way then of communicating with this great complexity, or I won't say there's no way, but it would have been much more challenging and much more simply generative of word count, right? It would have taken much longer for us to have this same insight into Marianne's interiority if the book were focused entirely on Eleanor, would be my take. But that doesn't mean that you can't do, 2 books. I think 2 books may well have been the answer here, yeah. And Skip is saying, I feel that it's intentional that we follow Marianne's story more closely as her emotions are so big. It makes for good storytelling. Yes, I think that there's, it's this idea. Eleanor is the default protagonist because she's the elder girl. She is the Miss Dashwood. But Marianne has the bigger feelings. And there is this idea in a kind of narratological approach to storytelling that the person who cares more is your protagonist, right? The person with more on the line, the person who is bleeding more, the person whose goals are more distinct, more compelling, more powerful, the person who is facing more conflict is your protagonist, because that's where the story wants to be. The story wants to kind of pull toward that character like a compass trying to point north. And Marianne is all of that, right? So it's again, it's an interesting balancing act that we have Marianne behaving like this. We have all of her stories, and a lot of those scenes are in Eleanor's POV, but we also manage to cultivate Eleanor in such a way as she remains, I think. Yeah, I would say that Eleanor's the primary protagonist of this text, although it is, as I say, very close and very balanced. Let's keep pushing onward here. In the next chapter, Eleanor handles the visit from Mrs. Jennings, which is not one of Mrs. Jennings' worst appearances in the book, honestly, but is this usual combination of gossipy interest coupled with a basic functional apathy, right? She kind of wants to know the details, but does not in any way want to meaningfully help, except in the extent that her help can be read as a charitable act, that it can do something to boost her own position in society, that it can reflect well upon her. We learn at this point that Willoughby, per his letter, is now happily engaged to £50,000, which is probably enough for a man like Willoughby, right? That is, by the way, a fantastic sum of money. This is, of course, I'm being facetious. He's not really directly engaged to £50,000. He's engaged to Miss Sophia Gray, who possesses a fortune of £50,000, which I didn't get time to check before I sat down tonight, but my gut feeling is that the largest fortune that Austen ever tells us about? Do we ever go above £50,000, particularly for a woman holding a fortune in her own right? Because that is a staggering sum of money. You'll remember last week we were talking about Marianne idly daydreaming about how comfortably she could live on a mere £2,000 a year, which, as I said at the time, puts her in the top 0.6% of the population. £50,000 a year, just a fortune of £50,000 a year would yield much more than £2,000 a year in interest, right? It is a genuinely colossal amount of money, like almost a sarcastically large amount of money. Speaking of whom, right? Oh, the other thing that we do, I'll hesitate away from Willoughby at this point to note that this is when Mrs. Jennings, in addition to her judgment on everything that is happening, opines that at least now Colonel Brandon will be able to marry Marianne and all will be well, kind of continuing this idea that Mrs. Jennings sees Colonel Brandon as a very desirable match, even for Mrs. Palmer, right? There is no way, per Mrs. Palmer's story in last week's reading, that Mrs. Jennings would have opposed her daughter marrying Colonel Brandon. We're really leaning on the idea that the new Mrs. Palmer, that Charlotte Jennings as was never going to marry Colonel Brandon. Speaking of whom, Colonel Brandon then stops by to reveal that he has overheard the news of Willoughby's engagement. He inquires as to Marianne's health and then leaves, only to return the following day with a longer purpose, a greater purpose, a larger purpose. And as I said at the beginning of tonight's session, a real solid candidate for scene of the book. Let's get into it here. "I met Mrs. Jennings in Bond Street," said he after the first salutation, "and she encouraged me to come on. I was the more easily encouraged because I thought it probable that I might find you alone, which I was very desirous of doing. my object, my wish, my sole wish in desiring it, I believe it is to be a means of giving comfort. No, I must not say comfort, not present comfort, but conviction, lasting conviction to your sister's mind. My regard for her, for yourself, for your mother, will you allow me to prove it by relating some circumstances which nothing but a very sincere regard, nothing but an earnest desire of being useful. I think I am justified, though, where so many hours have been spent in convincing myself that I am right. Is there not some reason to fear I may be wrong? He stopped. I understand you, said Eleanor. You have something to tell me of Mr. Willoughby that will open his character further. Your telling it will be the greatest act of friendship that can be shown, Marianne. My gratitude will be ensured immediately by any information tending to that end, and hers must be gained by it in time. Pray, let me hear it. You shall. And to be brief, when I quitted Barton last October, but this will give you no idea. I must go further back. You will find me a very awkward narrator, Miss Dashwood. I hardly know where to begin. A short account of myself, I believe, will be necessary, but it shall be a short one on such a subject. Sighing heavily, I can have little temptation to be diffuse. Of all the great monologues that we get in Austen, and I know that this is not the most elegant one, it's not the most composed, it's not the most considered, it's not the most poetical, but for me, it is the most powerful. Austen here is absolutely recognizing an authenticity that comes from awkwardness. This is a really strong recurring beat throughout the English canon, right? I always think of Twelfth Night in this regard, where all of these abundant and elaborate declarations of love are all seen in time to have been insubstantial, to have been, if not false, then at least superficial. There's a pantomime happening here, right? They are play acting the part of love in Twelfth Night, except for the one very brief, very earnest declaration of love that we get from Viola, which is just this plain, unadorned thing. And it is more true because it is plain and unadorned and kind of awkward. And I think that Austen is really pulling this out. And this also ties into our discussions last week of the Romantic period, right? One of the reasons that we want this return to a simple past, to this Arcadian idyll, is that people were just simple then. People just kind of spoke their mind and did so ungainly. There wasn't the same reliance on eloquence. There wasn't the same reliance on argumentation. It seems as though to struggle, to do your thinking out loud, makes you a more believable narrator. And there's maybe never a better example of that than this. I just think this is so brilliant. I just think that it is so completely poised. It takes nothing away from his solemnity or his gravitas here. It takes nothing away from the strength of his character that he is hesitant here, right? It's very easy to imagine a comedic version of a scene like this where the person is a complete flibbertigibbet, where the person is just, unable to hold on to a single idea, right? 200 years after this, Hugh Grant will basically weaponize this kind of approach to dialogue in order to be less threatening, in order to be charming, in order to be kind of boyish and diffident in his declarations. Here it is so perfectly balanced and so perfectly thoughtful. Here we see that Colonel Brandon is exhibiting a kind of sense that is extremely similar to Eleanor's, but this is coupled, and spoilers, this is the theme of the book, right? This sense, this solemnity, this seriousness, this gravity that we attribute and that we see in the words of Colonel Brandon throughout the book, this is mixed with exactly that depth of feeling that we discussed last time, right? That he has these huge feelings, these feelings that Marianne denied the possibility of when first they met, but they have been there the whole time. He is the unity of sense and sensibility. Elizabeth saying, I just keep thinking of how perfect the film is. Rickman in this scene is perfection, and Willoughby in the last scene too, though I never remember the actor's name. I mean, Rickman is perfect in this. We're going to watch, and I say this to the audience in general, as a heads up on a bonus episode that I'm going to prepare next week, and to my partner Elizabeth as a plan for later this evening or possibly tomorrow. We're going to watch the 2008 Andrew Davis Sense and Sensibility miniseries. It is 3 episodes. It is 3 hours almost exactly, almost on the dot. Willoughby there is Dominic Cooper, which I think is extremely, extremely interesting. That cast, by the way, is stacked. It wasn't always the easiest show to find and to track down. As far as I'm aware, there has never been a Blu-ray release of that series. I think that the version that is streaming live on Amazon Prime may not even be full HD, but it's remarkable. And if you're not convinced by Dominic Cooper as Willoughby, maybe you will be convinced by Dan Stevens as Edward. Maybe you will be convinced by David Morrissey as Brandon. Maybe you will be convinced, no, you won't, but I will be, by the fantastic Daisy Haggard, who is a comedic performer that you may know from the show Episodes, the Tamsin Gregg, Matt LeBlanc, Stephen Mangan show Episodes. She's so terrific in that as the comedy producer who does not find anything funny. And of course, she's in the James Corden episode of Doctor Who. And is still great, despite the fact that it's a James Corden episode of Doctor Who. So that has to be an absolute testament to the skill of Daisy Haggard. Yeah. But obviously, yeah, the Dan Stevens of it all is pretty attractive too. Okay, so we get then this account of the truth, right? Because this isn't just an interesting story that Brandon is giving us. It's not just a point of emotional contact here. We're actually getting the backstory here for Willoughby. We're getting most of the backstory here for Willoughby. I might append the extra detail just to kind of put it in your head, because I'm sure it's not a surprise to anyone at this point. So let's tell the story. Once upon a time, young Colonel Brandon, not yet a colonel, just, Brandon, was in love with his cousin Eliza. It's unclear, by the way, from the text how close a cousin she is. It is possible that they are not first cousins. It is possible that they are more distantly related, though it wasn't completely out of the question for first cousins to marry in the Regency period or in the earlier Georgian period, which I guess is where we would have to relocate that. Again, the timeline around Sense and Sensibility is a confounding thing. Eliza is supposed to marry Brandon's older brother, but she refuses, and they're about to elope to Scotland, a thing that was done all the time, right? There is a place on the border between Scotland and England called Gretna Green, which has for centuries been a place where young English couples in love could flee to and be married, because the age of consent in Scotland was 16 and you did not need parental permission to get married. That is a horrifying thing that I just said out loud right now, but it was true for a very, very long time. The age of consent in England, I think, was 16 also, but you did need parental consent, I believe, up to the age of 21 in the Regency period, though I would have to double check the history on that. So fleeing to Scotland to get married, absolutely a thing that was done. But before they could flee, before they could elope, they were sold out by her maid, and she was forced into this marriage with Brandon's brother. Brandon responds in the way that one does, by joining the military and going off to the East Indies, a weirdly archaic term for the Philippines and for Indonesia and for New Guinea and for Borneo. Basically, as far on the surface of the earth from England as is possible to be. Unhappy in her marriage, Eliza has an affair and is scandalously divorced. You might remember in an earlier episode, or perhaps it was over on the Discord, I don't remember if it was actually even in a live episode, but I believe that the divorce rate in England through the early Regency period was 2 per year. 2 in the whole country. So the fact that she is divorced at all has completely ruined her name. And the fact that she is carrying her lover's child is all the worse. She is left with this tiny fragment of the wealth, the significant wealth that she had going into her marriage. And even that gets traded away for some temporary comfort. 3 years later, Brandon finds her dying of consumption in a sponging house, which is not a spa, as the name might suggest, a bathhouse, but rather a kind of a kind of fiscal purgatory, right? A kind of a place where you go to be drained of every last penny that you have before you are sent to debtor's prison. It is like the last place where you can be reached by the outside world before you are locked away in misery. Brandon rescues her then. He pays off her debts. He takes her to comfortable lodging, where unfortunately she dies, at which point he takes her daughter with her lover, also named Eliza, as her ward. Eliza Jr. then goes off to school, though they visit often, and she remains there until she is 14 years old, at which point Brandon takes her out of school, at which point, in fairness, school for young women finishes, right? It's not as though he pulled her out in the middle of her sophomore year and packed her off to this cottage where she could hang out with other girls her own age, but rather that she had completed the necessary schooling, and that he took her out and takes her to this household in Dorset with, as I say, other girls her same age. 2 years after that, so Eliza is now 16, they go on vacation to Bath in Somerset, and that is where she meets Willoughby. She disappears around the time that Eleanor and Marianne's father dies. That's February of the year before, right? We are now, again, pretty much in February, so it's been roughly a year since that happened, and he doesn't get word until October. That's when he gets the letter from Eliza. He cancels the outing to Whitwell, and he leaves that very moment for London. There is some other material that we will get about Willoughby and exactly what happens with his departure from Dorset at the same time. Basically that he has been found out and he flees. He takes off. We then found out that they did meet in London. Brandon challenged him to a duel, but unfortunately Willoughby survived and escaped unscathed, which was the most frequent outcome of a duel at the time. In the early Regency, we have switched to duels being fought with guns. And guns at that period are notoriously inaccurate. It is very, very difficult to hit someone at a dueling distance such that you can, even hitting someone is hard. Killing someone is very difficult with a dueling pistol at that time. But dueling remains, partly because of its relative safety, a big part of Georgian culture. It's one of these fascinating things that is so important and then disappears so quickly, and no one complains about it. It's in 1844 that I believe it's just called the Military Act, is passed that outlaws dueling among military officers. It's just, this is not how we are going to conduct ourselves. Dueling is now absolutely illegal, and that move basically strips it of its grandeur. It strips it of its sense of honor. It strips it of its place in society, and very quickly dueling becomes unfashionable and then unthinkable. That law is passed in 1844, and the last duel fought in England happens in 1852. It is that quick. 8 years from being a really significant part of kind of societal masculinity among the upper echelons of English society. It goes from being a very important part of that culture to disappearing entirely really quickly. And of course, yes, Skipa gave in and quoted Hamilton here, everything's legal in New Jersey, yes. Did Brandon know she ran off with Willoughby at that time? I believe that he did not know that she ran off with Willoughby at that time. It's not until the letter and his going to London that he understands that it was with Willoughby, yeah. Yes, as Skipa saying, it's still 16 in Scotland, the age of marriage. Yes, it is. And Elizabeth saying the story was so confusing. It is confusing. It is a moment where you are grateful for voiceover in modern cinema. I think that you can give the story, you can have this gorgeous text of Brandon's kind of explanation of what has occurred, but then also show what has occurred, right? Really give it some heft there. Because he's also kind of walking this line of discretion. He's being not exactly circuitous, right? And not exactly evasive, but he is being discreet. He is being dignified, and he has people still within this story to protect, both Elizas, right? The love of his life, the first love of his life, and now his ward too. He is desirous of their protection. He wants to make sure that he is not exceeding himself. This is an interesting this kind of response to the temptation of gossip, I suppose, is an interesting thing. You'll remember that when Brandon first comes to Eleanor to ask after Marianne, when she is first upset because Willoughby has not responded to her letters since they have arrived in London, we have this moment with Eleanor where she hesitates. She doesn't know what to say because she doesn't know what the truth is. She doesn't actually know what the situation was between Marianne and Willoughby, excuse me. So she hesitates, and then she runs the risk of saying rather too much than too little. She kind of has to, what she is weighing there is not just what is the truth. She can say very clearly, I don't know, I thought they had a thing, but maybe they didn't have a thing, right? She's kind of aware of her own thoughts, but she doesn't want to misrepresent her sister. This idea of protecting the reputations of others is so important in Sense and Sensibility, and frankly, such an anathema to modern readers. I think it's very difficult sometimes to put ourselves entirely in that place. And that is a thing too, of course, which, we're going to talk a little more about secrets. Obviously here we're talking about a great many secrets, but we talked a little, we opened the door in last week's reading to discuss how having the secret about Edward has kind of bonded Eleanor and Lucy Steele, that they are in community with each other now because of this secret. And that does obligate Eleanor, I think, to protect Lucy's reputation to a certain extent. There is just a sense of decency at play there. Okay, let's keep pushing on here. Did I say everything that I needed to say about Brandon's story? Yes, I think that I did. So wildly, And I don't know what to make of this. I don't know why we don't get this this story. And I don't know why we focus on Brandon's explanation of the story to Eleanor rather than the scene which would immediately follow it. The scene which we know immediately follows it, though we do not get it in the book, which is Eleanor telling Marianne this version of the story. Instead, we get and maybe I'm answering my own question, right? Maybe it is about dignity. Maybe it is about giving us the actual direct transcript of what Brandon says rather than encapsulating that story, as I just did here on the podcast, somewhat scandalously and shamefully. We don't get the scene where Eleanor tells Marianne what has happened. Instead, we pick up chapter 10 of volume 2 with the story already told, with Marianne still miserable, though perhaps a little less than before and very slowly on the mend. They're stuck in London because of courtesy to Mrs. Jennings and because Mrs. Dashwood has now written, because things aren't bad enough. Mrs. Dashwood has now written to say that their brother and sister-in-law are also on their way. So we fast forward through, the Willoughby wedding. We get some more gossipy accounts of what is happening here, largely related to us by Mrs. Palmer. And then Mr. and Mrs. Willoughby depart from London, only to be replaced in the narrative by the Miss Steeles. We get some light satire at the expense of Anne, the elder Miss Steele, and her coach beau, right, Dr. Davis. We get this idea that she does not want to be teased about Dr. Davis, except she absolutely wants to be teased about Dr. Davis, because to be teased by Dr. Davis is exhilarating. And what's really interesting about that is that it is an inversion of what we have seen previously, right? One of the things that we called out about Mrs. Jennings is how shamefully, how shamefully is maybe too much, shamelessly, I suppose, is probably more appropriate, right? How shamelessly she teases all the girls in her kind of circle of acquaintance about their romantic entanglements, and how Eleanor and Marianne do not like it when she does that. Partly it's because they're keeping secrets, but partly it's because it's a little gauche. But here, Anna Steele, who is just, a simpler thing, right? Lacking in education, lacking in propriety, kind of just takes to it. She really loves being teased about her coach beau. In chapter 33, we have the Miss Dashwoods venturing out once more, coming across an odious, vain guy in the shop, a preening coxcomb of a man in the shop, who I'm sure we won't see again. And then we get an extended scene with John, a little of whom goes a long way, right? I'm really feeling, again, the story is starting to lag here. The pace is starting to lag here. We're getting a lot more of the satire, but a lot less of the plot. And later in her career, Austen will be able to more deftly interweave these things. But we are really, it feels like, on a scene-by-scene basis, moving between plot and a little bit of social commentary, right? A little bit of characterization, a little bit of comedy. We're kind of relieving the tension in the way that comic relief is intended to, but we're also just kind of getting these extended caricatures of just vile dudes. Although I will note, this is also where we learn that following in Willoughby's footsteps, Edward is now engaged to £30,000. Not quite as good as £50,000, but still an admirable sum. Miss Morton, of course, is the lucky girl. If a joke's worth doing once, it's worth doing twice. I have chosen here a representative sample of the scene with, if I can get to it, of the scene with John, which are all basically oriented around money and this long kind of comedic dissertation on John's financial concern and his own miserliness, right? His own unwillingness to be generous with his family while also pleading poverty, right? Which is the real kind of comedic nut at the heart of the characterization of John Dashwood here, is that he will claim poverty because he does not want to be generous. And we see that realized very fully here in this line. Your expenses both in town and country must certainly be considerable, but your income is a large one. Not so large, I dare say, as many people suppose. I do not mean to complain, however. It is undoubtedly a comfortable one, and I hope will in time be better. The enclosure of Norland Common, now carrying on, is a most serious drain. And then I have made a little purchase within this half year, East Kingham Farm. You must remember the place where old Gibson used to live. The land was so very desirable for me in every respect, so immediately adjoining my own property, that I felt it my duty to buy it. I could not have answered it to my conscience to let it fall into any other hands. A man must pay for his convenience, and it has cost me a vast deal of money. More than you think it really and intrinsically worth? Well, I hope not that. I might have sold it again the next day for more than I gave, but with regard to the purchase money, I might have been very unfortunate indeed, for the stocks were at the time so low that if I had not happened to have the necessary sum in my banker's hands, I must have sold out to very great loss. Eleanor could only smile. So, the satire here, I think, is pretty clear. Pleading poverty after buying a property adjacent to his own home with ready cash that he had, which would have been a financial strain on him if he hadn't had the cash. But because, of course, he had the cash, he did not have to liquidate any stocks to buy this property, and thus was put under no financial strain at all. Not to mention the enclosure, of Norland Common. He is taking this common space. Right? The common is a place where everyone, regardless of their social status, can take their animals to graze, and he is enclosing it. We are seeing a move here from a kind of figure of the landed gentry to something that is more predatory, more commercial, more capitalistic, and more modern. And there's not really a lot to say here, except for, I suppose, yes, it is a very deft, very cute, very sharp, very relevant piece of satire. And we continue to characterize Eleanor with enormous acuity, with this enormous precision and a great deal of care, but also a great deal of brevity, right? We get these two lines from her. Your expenses, both in town and country, must certainly be considerable, but your income is a large one. And he's, oh, no, well, I wouldn't say. And then when he says that he extends himself to buy East Kingham Farm because he simply can't think of anyone else having it. And he says that he pays for it. And she says, more than you think it really and intrinsically worth. And he says, no, I could have sold it the next day for a profit. It was already a good investment before I did. I'm not underwater on any of this, you understand? I just really like money. And then we cap it, of course, with Eleanor could only smile. Money, it turns out, does not mean the same thing to everyone. I'll also call out here as we're moving forward, because we are accelerating through the book at this point, but I do want to call out the recurring beat in this part of the book, which I kind of alluded to earlier. Colonel Brandon is as devoted to Marianne as ever. Eleanor is as devoted to Marianne as ever. But every other character in the book notes that Marianne, in her grief, has lost this bloom of beauty, this bloom of youth, her finer quality and character, right? She is, I don't know, physically older. She appears physically older, more careworn than she did before because of her grief and the stress of these recent events. Thus, at 16 years of age, Marianne is now over the hill and no longer capable of securing such a great marriage prospect as once she was. In the parlance of the Regency period, this is messed up. This is really tough. We wind up this, it's so gross, especially from John, says Elizabeth. It's so gross. It's just really, and it is so comprehensive, and these people are not like colluding with one another, right? And spoilers, there is not actually a really great conspiracy, a global conspiracy with Marianne as its target here. These people aren't colluding with one another, which makes me think that she probably is just careworn. She is, she's had a Leland Palmer in Twin Peaks. Now her hair has gone white all at once, and she's kind of a changed person. Let's pick up here. We've got, what have we got? 2 more slides to go. Look at this. We're almost done for the evening, because we wind up in a scene with Lucy, thrilled to bits and self-deluded that Mrs. Ferrers favors her, believing that she knows of her engagement to Edward. And Eleanor is playing it cool, or trying to, and then Edward himself shows up, which is a moment of absolutely cosmic and legendary embarrassment for all concerned. It was a very awkward moment, and the countenance of each showed that it was so. They all looked exceedingly foolish, and Edward seemed to have as great an inclination to walk out of the room again as to advance further into it. The very circumstance in its unpleasant form, which they would each have been most anxious to avoid, had fallen on them. They were not only all 3 together, but were together without the relief of another person. The ladies recovered themselves first. It was not Lucy's business to put herself forward, and the appearance of secrecy must still be kept up. She could therefore only look her tenderness, and after slightly addressing him, said no more. Passing once again the burden of social lubrication to Eleanor. Once again, Eleanor is the one who has to make small talk. Eleanor is the one who has to convey to Edward the answer to all of these little questions which he ought to have asked out of courtesy. So she's not just doing this heavy social lifting for Lucy, but for Edward too. How does Eleanor wind up in these situations? And then brilliantly, one of my favorite moments of genuine comic relief and a release of stress and tension at the end of the sequence, after these 3 have been like locked in this awful pressure cooker environment, Marianne comes in, all exclamation points, like a good-natured natural disaster, just kind of sweeping through and carrying all the way in her path. It's really strong. And that basically does it, because the last chapter of the volume is the party, where we introduce the only serious competition to John Dashwood in terms of being the worst man ever. Robert Ferrers, Edward's older brother, a man who, God, just loves a cottage. Let's take a look at this quote. Some people imagine that there can be no accommodations, no space in a cottage, but this is all a mistake. I was last month at my friend Elliot's near Dartford. Lady Elliot wished to give a dance. But how can it be done, said she. My dear Ferrers, do tell me how it can be managed. There is not a room in this cottage that will hold 10 people, and where can the supper be? I immediately saw that there could be no difficulty in it, so I said, my dear Lady Elliot, do not be uneasy. The dining parlour will admit 18 couple with ease. Card tables may be placed in the drawing room. The library may be open for tea and other refreshments, and let the supper be set out in the saloon. Lady Elliot was delighted with the thought. We measured the dining room and found that it would hold exactly 18 couple, and the affair was arranged precisely after my plan. So that, in fact, you see, if people do but know how to set about it, every comfort may be as well enjoyed in a cottage as in a more spacious dwelling. Eleanor agreed to it all, for she did not think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition. And if I was still on Twitter, if we were still on Twitter collectively, the good-hearted people of the world, if we were still on Twitter, I think you do not deserve the compliment of rational opposition would be a really great Twitter bio. The joke here, of course, is not only that he is so pompous, not only that he is just so odiously intrusive, he's name-dropping these people of significance, right? Eleanor may not know them, or certainly the narrative voice doesn't shore up Eleanor's knowledge in this regard, but he is name-dropping, the great and the good of the country at the time, but he's also presuming this knowledge, this insight, this capacity far exceeding his own. And underlying all of that, too, of course, is this this gross exaggeration of what a cottage is, right? This is not a cottage. This thing that he enjoys, this is a manifestation, by the way, of what we were discussing last week in terms of the push toward the romantic idyll, right? The idea that cottages are now desirable stems from this idea that we want a simple life in the countryside. We don't want a sprawling 18-bedroom palace. We don't want a manor house. We want something much more rural, something much more rustic, a simple, 8-bedroom affair with a ballroom and a library and a saloon, of course, right? This is the obliviousness of men like Robert Ferrers. And as I say, we can take this discussion over to the Discord or over to Blue Sky, where I am now instead of Twitter, of course, and we can discuss whether or not we think that John Dashwood or Robert Ferrers is the worst person in the world. That is going to do it for this week's episode. A brief programming note, a scheduling note, if you will, because over on the Patreon page, the Stars and Swords listeners have voted on the text that we are going to cover in our next unit, which is going to be our modern horror unit. I'm really looking forward to it. We're going to be doing it, September-ish, leading up to spooky season proper. We're not going to be talking about Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. That was one of the options. We're not going to be talking about Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumford, and we're not going to be talking, yet at least, about Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. We are instead going to be talking about this dark folklore, this fairy tale story set in the northeast of Scotland, David Sodergren's The Har. That's H-A-A-R. If you're not familiar with the Scots word for this freezing sea fog that rolls in off the cold North Sea and shrouds the landscape for many miles in this frigid embrace. It's a really thrilling, wild, weird thing to happen in real life, and here in terms of the story, it is used to chilling effect. Let's take a quick look at the schedule for the remainder of this unit, though. September 18th, Volume 3, Chapters 1 to 7. That is Chapter 37 to 43 in the unvolumized book. That takes us up to the great line, the last line of that chapter of Volume 3, Chapter 7, or Chapter 43, excuse me. The last line, you'll know it when you get to it, is, she rushed forwards towards the drawing room. She entered it and saw only Willoughby. That's the last line of next week's reading. So when you hit that, feel free to stop. And then we'll wrap up a week after with the bonus episode on the 1995 Ang Lee Sense and Sensibility. As I say, I'm hoping possibly even before we sit down together next week to have that bonus episode on the Andrew Davis 2008 mini-series, which is, as I say, is streaming on Amazon Prime and really difficult to get hold of anywhere else. If you have a local lending library, I would suggest maybe checking them out. There are DVD copies out there in the wilderness, but if you're trying to stream it, Amazon Prime seems to be the place, and that will do it for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Thank you for joining me. Please visit patreon.com/nextword. You can follow that page for free, where you will get the link to these live sessions. If you want to come and hang out with me over Thursday evening, if you want to come and hang out with Elizabeth and Skipa and whoever makes their way here to sit down and chat in our saloon, which has now been carefully arrayed with refreshments, so that we can talk about Jane Austen's fantastic book. We've got 2 more weeks of this, and I'm really going to miss it when it's gone. But don't worry, we've got a lot of other Austen books that we can cover, next year and the year after and every year thereafter until we're done with her canon. Also, you can visit patreon.com/nextword to pledge a few dollars to help me, secure all of this stuff. More popsicles, more duct tape, more Elmer's glue. That's what I need to get this studio really fixed. Just a bushel full of each, and we'll be in a stable position going forward. I give you my word. That is going to do it. Oh, patreon.com/nextword also gets you access to those aforementioned bonus episodes. 2 more to come in the very near future. Next week, then, our penultimate session on Sense and Sensibility. I'm really looking forward to it. Until then, take care and good night. Thanks all.